For over 200 years, an army raised in the Indian subcontinent marched across the world. From the plains of India to the trenches of Europe, from African deserts to Southeast Asian jungles, Indian soldiers fought wars that shaped global history. They served under foreign command, carried imperial flags, and became one of the most powerful military forces of the British Empire. This is the story of how the Indian Army was formed, used, and transformed. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for taking the time to explore history together. Today's story explains the Indian Army, not just as a fighting force, but as a system shaped by empire, control, loyalty, and resistance. For generations, Indian soldiers stood at the heart of British military power. Their discipline, courage, and sacrifice made global empire possible. Before we begin, consider this question. Was the Indian Army a symbol of honor and service, or a tool created to protect imperial rule? Share your thoughts, and let us begin. In the middle of the 18th century, the Indian subcontinent stood at a crossroads of power and uncertainty. Kingdoms rose and fell, alliances shifted quickly, and warfare was a familiar part of political life. Along the coast, European trading companies operated behind fortified walls, focused on commerce rather than conquest. Among them was the British East India Company, a commercial organization with limited military strength and fragile security. British forces in India during this period were small, scattered, and vulnerable. Company settlements depended on the goodwill of local rulers and the balance of regional politics. Any disruption could threaten trade, profit, and survival. The company had no standing army capable of defending vast territories. What it possessed instead was a growing awareness that military protection was essential if it wished to remain in India. To survive, the company turned to local manpower. Indian soldiers, later known as sepoys, were recruited from nearby villages and towns. Many had previous experience with regional armies and were accustomed to discipline and combat. The company offered regular pay, uniforms, and a degree of stability that appealed to men living in an age of frequent conflict. The company offered regular pay, uniforms, and a degree of stability that appealed to men living in an age of frequent conflict. Training camps emerged near company settlements. European officers introduced new drills, formations, and weapons, blending them with local traditions of service. Muskets replaced older arms, ranks were organized, and daily routines enforced order. This was not yet a national army, but it was the beginning of something structured and enduring. These early sepoy forces were defensive in purpose. They guarded warehouses, escorted caravans, and protected company officials. Their presence allowed British traders to move with greater confidence through contested regions. Over time, as trust grew, sepoys became the backbone of company security, far outnumbering British soldiers brought from overseas. The fragile arrangement of trade and defense began to change dramatically in the 1750s. Bengal, one of the richest regions in India, became the center of rising tension. Control over revenue, influence, and authority was fiercely contested among local elites. The East India Company found itself drawn into these struggles, not by grand design, but by circumstance and opportunity. In 1757, this tension erupted into open conflict at the Battle of Plassey. Though brief, the battle proved decisive. On the field, Indian troops trained and paid by the company played a crucial role. They marched, held positions, and supported a British-led force that was small in number but disciplined and well-organized. Victory at Plassey reshaped the balance of power. The company gained control over Bengal's administration and revenue, transforming it from a trading enterprise into a political authority. This shift would not have been possible without Indian soldiers. Their service secured not only a battlefield success, but the foundation of British dominance in eastern India. After Plassey, the company expanded its military ambitions. Sepoy recruitment increased rapidly. New regiments were formed, standards raised, and command structures refined. Military service under British officers became more formalized, with clearer rules, pay systems, and expectations. Indian soldiers now served in campaigns beyond simple defense. They enforced company authority, collected revenue, and intervened in disputes that favored British interests. Forts were strengthened, roads secured, and territories brought under tighter control. Each operation relied heavily on sepoys who knew the land and endured its harsh conditions. Despite their importance, power within the army remained unequal. Command positions were reserved for British officers, while Indian soldiers filled the ranks. Advancement was limited, and decision-making stayed firmly in foreign hands. Still, for many recruits, service offered opportunity, honor, and a sense of belonging within a powerful institution. Between 1750 and 1800, this military system expanded across large parts of India. The company's armies grew from scattered guards into coordinated forces capable of sustained campaigns. Indian soldiers became a permanent feature of British rule, their loyalty shaped by discipline, pay, and tradition. Daily life in the sepoy ranks followed a strict rhythm. Drills at dawn, inspections, and long marches defined their routine. Camps buzzed with activity, from weapon maintenance to cooking and prayer. Bonds formed between soldiers from different regions, creating shared identities within regiments. As the century drew to a close, the transformation was clear. The East India Company no longer depended on fragile agreements alone. It possessed an army rooted in Indian society, yet controlled by British authority. This force enabled expansion, enforced order, and protected growing political power. The origins of the Indian Army lie in this period of adaptation and necessity. Born from vulnerability, shaped by cooperation, and strengthened through conflict, it emerged as a central pillar of British presence in India. The victory at Plassey marked not just a change in rulers, but the beginning of organized Indian military service under British command. This early chapter set patterns that would endure for generations. Indian soldiers would continue to serve across regions and continents, while questions of power, loyalty, and recognition quietly followed them. Between 1750 and 1800, the foundations were laid for an army that would play a decisive role in the history of empire and the modern world. By the year 1800, the East India Company had moved far beyond its origins as a trading enterprise. It now governed wide stretches of the Indian subcontinent, controlling ports, cities, fertile plains, and strategic routes. This authority was not held by merchants alone. It rested on an expanding military force that grew larger with every campaign and every new territory brought under control. The company army expanded rapidly in size and structure. Recruitment reached deep into Indian society, drawing men from villages and towns across Bengal, the Deccan, and northern India. These soldiers formed the backbone of the force. They drilled daily, marched long distances, and learned to fight in coordinated formations that reflected European military methods. Their discipline and endurance became central to company power. While most of the soldiers were Indian, command remained firmly British. Officers were trained in distant academies and arrived with authority already granted. They issued orders, planned campaigns, and controlled promotion. This division defined the army from top to bottom. It created a system where responsibility was shared, but power was not. In the early years of the 19th century, the army was almost constantly on the move. One of its first major challenges came in the south, where the legacy of Mysore still shaped regional politics. Long campaigns tested supply lines and morale. Indian soldiers marched through unfamiliar landscapes, facing heat, disease, and resistance. Victory brought not rest, but further expansion. Attention soon turned west and north, toward the powerful Maratha Confederacy. These conflicts were among the largest and most complex the company had faced. Maratha forces were experienced and well organized, skilled in cavalry warfare and regional alliances. Battles stretched across vast areas, involving sieges, open engagements, and prolonged pressure. Once again, Indian troops bore the greatest burden, fighting and occupying territory in the name of company authority. As victories accumulated, so did territory. Forts were garrisoned, roads secured, and administrative centers established. The presence of the army made company rule visible and constant. For many communities, the army was the first direct sign of a distant power that now shaped daily life. Military success allowed Britain to dominate the subcontinent without deploying large numbers of European soldiers. A relatively small group of officers directed a massive Indian force. This arrangement was efficient and effective, but it relied on a delicate balance of discipline, loyalty, and control. The army was strong, yet it was built on inequality. Indian soldiers received regular pay, but it was significantly lower than that of British troops. Allowances differed. Living conditions varied. Promotion beyond certain ranks was rare, regardless of experience or ability. This reality was understood within the ranks, even if it was seldom openly discussed. Discipline was strict and constant. Training schedules were rigid. Punishments for disobedience were harsh. The army demanded obedience and reliability, and it largely received both. Many soldiers valued the stability the service provided. Regular wages supported families and offered security in uncertain times. Yet beneath this stability lay a quiet awareness of difference and distance. The army also became an instrument of governance. Soldiers collected revenue, escorted officials, and enforced new laws. They stood guard over courts and treasuries, reinforcing the authority of company administrators. Military strength did not merely conquer territory. It maintained control, day after day, year after year. As the decades passed, the company army became one of the largest standing forces in the world. Its reach extended from coastal regions to inland plains and hill territories. Campaigns against smaller regional kingdoms filled the gaps between major wars, steadily reducing independent rule. Each success tightened company control and expanded British influence. Yet growth brought tension. The army's size increased faster than trust. Cultural differences required careful management. Religious practices, food customs, and social hierarchies were regulated to prevent unrest. Officers understood that disrespect could lead to resistance. Still, the system rested on authority rather than equality. By the 1840s and 1850s, company dominance appeared secure. Military power had reshaped the political map of India. Regional rulers had been defeated or absorbed. Trade routes and taxation systems were firmly under company control. The army stood as both shield and sword of this empire. But the same structure that enabled expansion also carried hidden strain. Indian soldiers had given loyalty, labor, and lives to build this system. In return, they remained confined within narrow limits. Their service was essential, yet their recognition was restricted. Between 1800 and 1857, expansion and control defined the company era. Military strength allowed Britain to dominate the subcontinent, not through numbers alone, but through organization and command. Indian soldiers made this dominance possible. Their discipline and sacrifice sustained an empire that relied on them, even as inequality shaped every aspect of their service. This balance of power and dependence created an army that was formidable on the battlefield, yet fragile beneath the surface. It was an army that conquered vast lands, enforced authority, and transformed history, while quietly carrying the weight of unresolved tension within its own ranks. In the early months of 1857, a sense of unease moved quietly through military camps across northern India. On the surface, daily routines continued as they always had. Drills were performed, orders were followed, and uniforms were worn with discipline. Yet beneath this appearance of order, years of frustration had been gathering strength. Indian soldiers served an empire that demanded loyalty but offered little respect, limited advancement, and deep cultural misunderstanding. The tension finally exploded into open rebellion. Indian soldiers turned against their British officers, breaking a bond that had been carefully maintained for decades. What began in isolated cantonments quickly spread outward, carried by rumor, fear, and shared anger. News traveled faster than official commands, and the uprising grew beyond any single plan or leader. Cities, towns, and villages across northern India were drawn into the conflict. Some areas erupted almost overnight, while others hesitated before choosing a side. British authority, once seen as firm and unshakable, suddenly appeared vulnerable. The rebellion challenged not only military control but the very belief that British rule was secure and accepted. British officials responded with urgency and alarm. Reinforcements were rushed in from other regions and from overseas. Columns of troops moved through contested land, determined to restore order at any cost. Fighting erupted in streets, forts, and open countryside. Control shifted back and forth as both sides struggled to gain the upper hand. The suppression of the rebellion was forceful and relentless. By the end of 1858, organized resistance had been crushed. The cost was heavy, leaving deep scars across the land and in the memories of those who lived through it. The rebellion failed in its immediate aims, but its impact would reach far beyond the battlefield. In London, the uprising triggered intense debate. The East India Company, which had ruled large parts of India for nearly a century, was blamed for arrogance and failure. It was clear that the existing system could no longer continue. The rebellion had exposed weaknesses in governance, military organization, and understanding of the society being ruled. In 1858, a historic change followed. Control of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. The East India Company was dissolved, ending an era that had begun with trade and grown into empire. Administration became more centralized, with greater oversight and stricter policies. The language of rule shifted, promising stability and reform, though real equality remained distant. One of the most significant changes came within the military. The rebellion had begun with soldiers, and the army was now seen as both essential and dangerous. In response, the British Indian Army was officially formed. This new force was carefully structured to prevent unity among Indian soldiers and reduce the chance of future revolt. Recruitment policies were rewritten. Certain communities were favored, while others were excluded based on British assumptions about loyalty and reliability. Ratios between British and Indian troops were adjusted to ensure firm control. Heavy weapons, especially artillery, were kept largely in British hands. Discipline became stricter, and surveillance more constant. The memory of 1857 influenced every parade, inspection, and command decision. Fear shaped policy as much as strategy. The army was no longer just a tool of expansion but a system designed to guard against internal threat. For Indian soldiers, the post-rebellion world was marked by suspicion and service continued, but trust was gone. Promotion opportunities narrowed, and loyalty was constantly tested. Many soldiers remained professional and disciplined. Yet the sense of partnership that once existed had been replaced by control and caution. Beyond the army, the rebellion reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. British governance became more rigid, more careful, and more distant. Cultural sensitivity was discussed but rarely practiced. Indian society, meanwhile, absorbed the lessons of the uprising. The idea that imperial power could be challenged had been proven, even if the cost was severe. The revolt of 1857 became a defining moment in the history of British rule in India. It marked the end of company dominance and the beginning of direct imperial control. It transformed the army, altered administration, and reshaped attitudes on both sides. Though the rebellion was defeated, its impact endured. It changed how India was governed and how empire understood itself. Beneath the restored order lay unresolved tensions that would surface again in new forms. The events of 1857 did not end resistance. They reshaped it. It changed its course forever. The memory of the uprising remained alive, passed through stories, silence, and reflection. It stood as a reminder that authority built on imbalance is never secure. The revolt had failed to overthrow empire, but it succeeded in changing its course forever. After 1858, silence settled over the parade grounds of India, but it was not peace. It was a pause filled with calculation. The uprising had shaken confidence, and the British authorities understood that the army they relied upon could not remain the same. If imperial rule was to survive, its military foundation had to be rebuilt. Reorganization began almost. Old assumptions were questioned. Command structures reviewed. And recruitment methods reshaped. Every lesson from the past was studied. With precision. Recruitment became a central focus. British planners believed loyalty and discipline could be shaped through selective enlistment. They turned their attention to regions they categorized as martial races, communities they believed possessed natural military qualities. From Punjab, the northwest frontier, and other selected areas, new regiments were raised with clear expectations and strict oversight. Training was standardized and intensified. Drill became exacting, schedules rigid, and obedience absolute. The goal was not only battlefield efficiency, but predictability. The rebuilt army was designed to function without hesitation, even under extreme pressure. Control was woven into every level of command. Indian officers were limited in number, while British officers retained key leadership roles. This ensured that strategic authority remained centralized. Yet on the ground, Indian soldiers formed the overwhelming majority of the ranks. Their discipline, endurance, and adaptability became the engine of the new force. As the army stabilized, its purpose expanded. Indian troops were no longer seen only as guardians of the subcontinent. They were now instruments of imperial policy beyond India itself. The first major test of this rebuilt army came in Afghanistan. From 1878 to 1880, Indian troops marched into rugged terrain where control was uncertain and resistance constant. The Second Anglo-Afghan War demanded endurance rather than spectacle. Mountain passes, supply shortages, and harsh climate tested every unit. Indian soldiers adapted quickly. Accustomed to difficult conditions, they secured lines of communication and held strategic positions. Their presence allowed sustained operations in a region where European troops struggled. The campaign reinforced British confidence in the reorganized army. To the east, Burma presented a different challenge. Dense forests, heavy rain, and unfamiliar terrain reshaped the nature of military operations. Indian troops advanced steadily, securing territory and enforcing new authority. Their work was methodical rather than dramatic, but without it control could not be maintained. The army's reach extended even farther west. In 1882, unrest in Egypt drew imperial forces into the Middle East. Indian soldiers were deployed to protect vital routes and infrastructure. They guarded the Suez Canal, a lifeline of empire, and reinforced garrisons across the region. Service in Egypt marked a turning point. It proved that Indian troops could operate effectively far from home, in climates and cultures entirely different from their own. Their role was increasingly logistical and defensive, yet essential. Empire depended on their presence to function smoothly. The pattern continued into Sudan during the 1880s and 1890s. Campaigns along the Nile demanded resilience. Heat, distance, and limited resources shaped every movement. Indian troops served as infantry, garrison forces, and support units, holding territory once it was taken. The culmination of this global deployment came in 1898. At Omdurman, near the Nile, one of the most decisive battles of the era unfolded. Indian soldiers formed part of a vast imperial force advancing against a determined opponent. Discipline and coordination were critical on the open battlefield. At Omdurman, modern warfare revealed its full power. Indian regiments moved in formation, maintaining order amid noise and confusion. Their role supported the broader strategy that secured British dominance in Sudan and strengthened control over northeastern Africa. Victory there symbolized the success of decades of military reorganization. By the end of the 19th century, the transformation was complete. The army rebuilt after 1858 was no longer a regional force. It had become a global one, capable of deployment across continents. Indian soldiers stood at the center of this system, forming its backbone. Yet the structure was built on imbalance. Authority remained concentrated at the top, and advancement for Indian soldiers was limited. Their service was praised, but tightly managed. Discipline ensured effectiveness, but also reinforced hierarchy. Still, the impact of this rebuilt army was undeniable. Between 1860 and 1900, it enabled the expansion and consolidation of empire on an unprecedented scale. From mountain passes to desert plains, Indian troops carried imperial power forward. They marched not for their own borders, but for distant ambitions. Their presence reshaped warfare and governance across Asia and Africa. In rebuilding the army, the British created a force that could project authority far beyond India. The legacy of that transformation would endure long after the 19th century closed. The structures, traditions, and experiences of this rebuilt army continued to influence military institutions. What began as a response to crisis became a foundation of imperial rule. Through discipline and deployment, the army rebuilt itself into a global force. And in doing so, reshaped the history of empire. Life within the Indian Army was shaped by structure from the very first day of service. Order defined every movement, every sound, and every expectation. Recruits entered a world where hierarchy was visible and constant, a system designed to function without pause across vast distances and varied landscapes. At the top of this structure stood British officers. Almost all senior positions were held by them, from regimental command to strategic planning. Authority flowed downward through ranks that rarely changed. Indian soldiers could rise through limited non-commissioned roles, gaining responsibility within their units. But the highest levels remained out of reach. This arrangement was understood by all, accepted as part of the system rather than questioned openly. Daily life followed precise routines. The day began early, often before sunrise. Roll calls were exact. Uniforms were inspected with care. Drill filled the mornings, reinforcing discipline through repetition. Movements were practiced until they became instinctive. The goal was unity of action, a force that responded as one body to command. Living arrangements reflected the same order. Indian soldiers were housed in segregated units, grouped by regiment and background. Barracks were clean, functional, and strictly regulated. Space was shared, privacy limited. These environments created strong bonds among soldiers who trained, ate, and rested together over many years. Cultural and religious practices were managed closely. The army recognized differences in belief and custom, but only within defined limits. Diets were arranged to meet religious requirements. Prayer times were acknowledged. Festivals were allowed in controlled forms. These accommodations were practical, designed to maintain morale and efficiency rather than equality. Identity was respected, but always supervised. Meals were predictable and sufficient, though simple. Rations were distributed on schedule, measured and consistent. Food became part of the rhythm of service, another marker of time within a structured day. For many soldiers, this regularity offered reassurance. In a world where uncertainty was common, the army promised consistency. Training extended beyond physical skill. Soldiers learned to maintain equipment, care for uniforms, and follow procedure without hesitation. Cleanliness was enforced. Discipline reached into every corner of life. Small mistakes carried consequences, reinforcing the importance of attention and obedience. Over time, these habits shaped behavior long after service ended. Despite restrictions, service offered something rare in a changing society: stability. The army provided steady income, paid on time, often sent directly to families back home. For villages dependent on agriculture and seasonal labor, this income mattered deeply. It paid debts. It supported parents. It funded marriages and education. The soldier became a pillar of economic security. Respect followed service. A man in uniform carried authority within his community. Stories of distant postings and long marches added to his standing. Even without wealth, service conferred dignity. The uniform symbolized sacrifice and endurance. The army also offered a sense of belonging. Regiments developed identities that lasted generations. Songs, traditions, and shared memories bound soldiers together. Within the ranks, experience mattered. Trust formed through shared hardship rather than rank alone. Time passed differently in service. Years blended into each other, marked by postings, drills, and leave. Many soldiers stayed for decades. What began as temporary employment became a lifelong profession. The army remained constant, its structure unchanged even as surroundings shifted. Leave periods brought soldiers home, but home itself changed. Families grew older. Children grew up. The soldier stood between two worlds, fully belonging to neither. Yet the army remained constant, its structure unchanged even as surroundings shifted. Challenges were ever present. Separation from family weighed heavily. Advancement was limited. Authority was distant. Still, many soldiers remained loyal to the institution. Not always out of devotion, but because the army offered something tangible in return for service. Security. Purpose. Identity. As years went by, retirement approached quietly. Soldiers left the barracks carrying habits learned through discipline. Early rising. Orderly living. Respect for structure. These traits shaped post-service life. Former soldiers often became leaders in their communities, trusted for their experience and composure. The structure and daily life of soldiers were not designed for comfort. Every rule served a purpose. Every restriction maintained control. Within this system, individuals adapted, endured, and found meaning in service. The story of daily life is not one of constant hardship or simple obedience. It is a story of balance. Between control and opportunity. Between limitation and respect. The Indian Army created soldiers through routine and hierarchy. And in doing so, shaped lives that extended far beyond the barracks. Leaving lasting marks on families, villages, and history itself. In the late summer of 1914, a chain of events in Europe ignited a conflict. Empires mobilized with urgency, and Britain found itself facing a war on a scale never before imagined. Almost immediately, the British government turned to India, recognizing that the strength of the empire depended on the men it could summon from across its vast territories. India responded with speed and scale. Recruitment centers opened across cities, towns, and rural districts. Men stepped forward from diverse regions and backgrounds, drawn by duty, tradition, steady pay, and the call to serve. Within months, the Indian Army expanded dramatically. By the end of the war, more than 1 million Indian soldiers had been recruited, forming one of the largest forces to fight under the British flag. These soldiers were not held in reserve. From the earliest days of the conflict, they were sent directly into active combat zones. In 1914 and 1915, Indian troops arrived on the Western Front at a critical moment. British forces were under immense pressure, and reinforcements were urgently needed. Indian units were rushed to France and Belgium, where they entered a landscape transformed by industrial warfare. The Western Front presented conditions unlike anything most Indian soldiers had experienced. Mud clung to boots and uniforms. And the air carried a constant mix of smoke and damp earth. Artillery fire echoed day and night, leaving little silence for rest or reflection. Indian soldiers adapted quickly to this harsh environment. They learned trench routines, night watches, and the careful movements required to survive under constant threat. Winters were especially brutal. Freezing temperatures numbed hands and feet. And the cold seeped into every layer of clothing. Yet units held their positions, carried out orders, and supported Allied operations during some of the war's most dangerous early battles. Casualties during these first years were heavy. Many soldiers fell in unfamiliar fields far from home. Others were wounded and carried to overcrowded medical stations, where recovery was uncertain. Letters sent back to India spoke of strange landscapes and relentless danger, often softened to spare families from worry. As the war expanded, Indian soldiers were deployed to multiple fronts beyond Europe. In Mesopotamia, they marched along rivers and across arid plains, facing heat, disease, and long supply lines. Campaigns there demanded endurance as much as courage. Soldiers guarded routes, fought in key engagements, and supported advances that reshaped the region's political future. In Africa, Indian units operated in challenging terrain, from dense forests to open savannas. The enemy was not only opposing forces, but also climate and illness. Despite these hardships, Indian troops maintained discipline and effectiveness, often praised by commanders for their resilience. At Gallipoli, Indian soldiers played vital supporting roles in a campaign marked by difficulty and sacrifice. They worked under constant threat, moving supplies, defending positions, and enduring harsh conditions on narrow stretches of land. Though the campaign did not achieve its objectives, the service of Indian troops remained essential to sustaining operations. Across all these theaters, the Indian Army demonstrated flexibility and strength. Their presence allowed Britain to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously, a task that would have been impossible without colonial manpower. Despite their vast contribution, recognition remained limited. Indian soldiers were praised for bravery. Yet advancement within the military hierarchy was restricted. Command positions stayed largely in British hands. And rewards often failed to match the scale of sacrifice. This imbalance did not go unnoticed. But it rarely disrupted discipline during the war years. This imbalance did not go unnoticed, but it rarely disrupted discipline during the war years. Back in India, the impact of the war was deeply felt. Communities adjusted to the absence of so many men. Economic patterns shifted, and families waited anxiously for news. The war connected distant villages to global events in unprecedented ways, making the conflict personal even for those far from the front lines. By 1918, the war reached its final phase. Indian soldiers continued to serve until the fighting ended, maintaining positions and supporting the final operations that led to victory. When peace finally arrived, celebrations were tempered by grief and exhaustion. Thousands of Indian soldiers never returned. Those who did carried memories of distant lands, relentless noise, and shared hardship. Their service had been crucial to the outcome of the war, even if it was not always fully acknowledged. The experience of World War I marked a turning point for the Indian Army. It proved its ability to operate on a global stage, and highlighted the deep reliance of the British Empire on Indian manpower. The scale of sacrifice raised lasting questions about loyalty, recognition, and the future relationship between India and imperial power. Between 1914 and 1918, Indian soldiers stood in trenches. Indian soldiers crossed deserts and marched through unfamiliar terrain in service of a distant war. Their contribution was vast, their endurance remarkable, and their story remains a vital part of the history of the First World War and the shaping of the modern world. When the First World War ended in 1918, a long silence followed the thunder of guns. They had marched through foreign cities, endured harsh climates, and fought in conflicts far removed from their villages and towns. Their return marked the beginning of a new and uncertain period, one shaped by expectation, reflection, and quiet change. The war had altered perspectives. Service overseas exposed soldiers to new ideas, different societies, and unfamiliar forms of authority. Many believed their loyalty and sacrifice would lead to meaningful political reform. The hope was not sudden or loud, but it was widespread. The belief grew that participation in a global struggle had earned a stronger voice at home. Across India, communities welcomed returning soldiers with pride. Uniforms were symbols of endurance and duty. Stories of survival and loss spread through marketplaces and homes. Yet alongside this pride, questions emerged. What had the war truly changed? What would follow now that peace had returned? In 1919, tension began to rise. The post-war world did not unfold as many had imagined. Political reforms were limited and cautious. Authority remained distant and firm. Public frustration surfaced in meetings, discussions, and acts of protest. Nationalist movements, once confined to smaller circles, began to reach broader sections of society. Former soldiers observed these developments closely. Many still valued order and discipline, shaped by years of service. The army itself remained outwardly loyal. Training continued. Barracks functioned as they always had. Drill routines and commands maintained their rhythm. But beneath this stability, attitudes were slowly shifting. Indian soldiers were no longer untouched by the political climate around them. Newspapers, speeches, and conversations carried ideas of self-determination and reform. These ideas did not always call for rejection of service, but they introduced doubt. They appealed to shared sacrifice and common identity. Veterans often found themselves respected voices within their communities. Their experiences gave weight to their opinions. For many soldiers, this created an inner conflict. The army had provided income, stability, and status. Service supported families and offered a sense of purpose. At the same time, the promise of equality and recognition felt increasingly distant. Advancement remained limited. Decision-making remained firmly controlled by others. The relationship between the army and the empire began to change, not through open rebellion, but through subtle shifts in belief. Trust, once assumed, required reinforcement. Respect, once taken for granted, was questioned. The emotional bond that tied service to loyalty grew thinner. Throughout the 1930s, these changes continued. Economic hardship affected many regions, adding to existing pressures. political movements became more organized and confident. Public debate about the future of India intensified. The army stood in the middle of this transformation, both part of the system and separate from it. Military authorities worked to preserve discipline and cohesion. They emphasized professionalism and tradition. Soldiers were reminded of duty and honor. For many, these values still held meaning. The army did not dissolve into uncertainty. It remained a functioning force, capable and organized. Yet the certainty of earlier decades was gone. Service was no longer viewed only as a path of loyalty. It was now one option among many ways to engage with the future. Some soldiers maintained faith in gradual change. Others quietly aligned themselves with broader hopes for political transformation. By the late 1930s, the space between army and empire had widened. It was not marked by dramatic breaks, but by accumulated doubt. The bond that had once seemed unbreakable had become conditional. Loyalty remained, but it was cautious and reflective. The years between the wars were shaped by waiting. Waiting for reform. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for a future that felt closer, yet still uncertain. Indian soldiers stood at the center of this waiting, shaped by their past service. And their changing expectations. They had given much during the war. In return, they sought dignity, fairness, and recognition. When these hopes were delayed, they did not disappear. They settled into the collective memory, influencing thought and action. Between 1919 and 1938, nationalism did not erase military loyalty, but it reshaped it. The relationship between army and empire weakened slowly, almost imperceptibly. What had once been unquestioned became debated. What had once been accepted became measured against experience. This period was not defined by collapse, but by transformation. The empire still stood. The army still served. But the foundation had shifted. The soldiers who marched through this era carried both discipline and doubt, duty and desire for change. As the world moved closer to another global conflict, the legacy of these years remained. The silence after the First War had spoken clearly. Expectations had risen, and they would not easily fall again. In September 1939, war broke out across Europe, and its shockwaves quickly reached the Indian subcontinent. India was drawn into the conflict without consultation, its fate once again tied to decisions made far away. As part of the British Empire, India entered the Second World War automatically. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary military mobilizations in modern history. Across towns, villages, and cities, recruitment expanded at an unprecedented pace. By the end of the war, over 2.5 million Indian soldiers had served in uniform. Men from different regions, languages, and traditions trained side by side, united by discipline and circumstance rather than choice. Training camps transformed landscapes. Fields became parade grounds, and quiet settlements filled with marching boots and shouted commands. Many recruits had never traveled beyond their home districts. Now they learned to handle modern weapons and adapt to strict routines. For some, military service offered steady pay and structure. For others, it was a burden accepted with resignation. The war soon carried Indian soldiers far from home. In North Africa, they faced endless deserts and intense heat. Supply shortages and fast-moving battles tested endurance as much as skill. Indian units fought alongside British and Allied forces, holding defensive lines and advancing through harsh terrain. Their reliability and resilience became essential to Allied success in the region. From the deserts, the conflict moved to Europe. In Italy, Indian soldiers encountered an entirely different kind of warfare. Mountain ranges, rivers, and fortified towns slowed every advance. Rain, cold, and exhaustion replaced sand and heat. Battles were fought inch by inch, often under constant pressure. Indian troops played a key role in breaking through defensive positions, contributing decisively to the long and costly campaign. While fighting continued in Europe, the war in Asia took a dramatic turn. Japanese forces advanced rapidly through Southeast Asia, challenging British dominance. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell to Japan. The defeat stuns the empire and shatters its image of invincibility. Captivity changed everything. Cut off from their commanders and uncertain of their future. Many prisoners faced hunger, illness, and isolation. In these conditions, long-standing assumptions about loyalty were questioned. Some captured soldiers later joined the Indian National Army, a force that sought to fight against British rule with Japanese support. Their choice reflected frustration, hope, and desperation rather than a single shared motive. The existence of the Indian National Army had a powerful psychological impact. It revealed that imperial authority over Indian soldiers was no longer absolute. Even those who remained loyal to the British command were deeply affected by the knowledge that alternatives now existed. The war was no longer just a distant struggle between great powers. It had become a conflict that touched the question of India's own future. At home, the strain of war grew heavier each year. Resources were diverted to support military operations. Factories worked around the clock, and transport networks were stretched to their limits. Civilian life was marked by shortages, rising prices, and uncertainty. Nationalist leaders watched closely, aware that the empire depended more than ever on Indian support. As the war dragged on, exhaustion spread through the ranks. Many Indian soldiers served for years without returning home. They witnessed the destruction of cities, the suffering of civilians, and the limits of imperial power. British officers, too, sensed change. The scale of Indian involvement made it clear that the empire could not survive in its old form. By 1945, the war reached its end. Victory brought relief. But it also revealed how deeply British power had been drained. Indian soldiers returned with new experiences and new perspectives. They had fought across continents, faced modern warfare, and seen the vulnerability of those who ruled them. The bond between empire and army had been stretched to its breaking point. The Second World War transformed the Indian Army and reshaped the political landscape. Service on such a massive scale strengthened confidence and awareness among those who had once been subjects rather than participants. The war exhausted British resources and authority, leaving little strength to resist growing demands for change. The Indian Army had carried a global burden, fighting in deserts, mountains, and jungles far from home. In doing so, it helped bring the war to an end. But it also helped bring an era to a close. By 1945, it was clear that the relationship between Britain and India had been permanently altered. The war ended, but its consequences did not. The sacrifices of millions of Indian soldiers had exposed the limits of empire. What followed would be shaped by that realization. The Indian Army in World War II had not only fought for victory abroad. It had quietly accelerated the end of imperial rule itself. By 1947, the age of British rule in India had reached its final hour. The authority that once governed a vast subcontinent was preparing to withdraw. Years of conflict, negotiation, and exhaustion had made continuation impossible. Independence was no longer a distant promise. It was an approaching reality. Across cities and cantonments, anticipation mixed with uncertainty. The end of colonial rule meant freedom, but it also meant change on a scale never experienced before. Institutions built over generations had to be reshaped in months. Among them stood the army, one of the most powerful and complex legacies of empire. The Indian Army had been created to serve imperial interests. For decades, it fought wars far from home and guarded the frontiers of British authority. Its traditions, command structure, and discipline were shaped under colonial control. Yet its soldiers were overwhelmingly Indian, drawn from many regions and communities. When independence arrived in August 1947, the army faced a defining moment. The subcontinent was divided into two new nations, India and Pakistan. With that division came the task of splitting a single military force into two separate armies. It was a transformation without precedent. The process began with urgency. Records were examined, units evaluated, and assets counted. Regiments that had once trained and fought together were now reassigned. Decisions were made based on geography, recruitment origins, and strategic needs. Time was limited, and pressure was constant. For soldiers, the division was deeply personal. Men who had served side by side for years now prepared to part ways. Friendships formed through shared hardship were tested by new borders. Barracks changed overnight, and familiar routines were replaced by uncertainty. For soldiers, the division was deeply personal. Movement defined those months. Trains carried soldiers across newly drawn boundaries. Equipment was transferred, command posts relocated, and new headquarters established. Old insignia were removed, and new symbols of national identity took their place. The transition was not only administrative. It was emotional. Many soldiers had known only one system of service. They had been trained to obey orders without question, not to choose allegiance. Now they were asked to serve nations that had only just come into being. For some, independence brought pride and purpose. Serving a sovereign homeland gave new meaning to duty. For others, the change carried uncertainty, as familiar authority disappeared. Yet discipline held. The army continued to function during a moment when chaos could have prevailed. As colonial command ended, responsibility shifted rapidly. Indian officers stepped into leadership roles previously denied to them. Training institutions were reorganized, doctrines reviewed, and priorities redefined. The army began to transform from an imperial tool into a national institution. Pakistan faced its own challenges. With fewer resources and limited infrastructure, it had to build command systems almost from nothing. Experienced soldiers became essential to this effort. Their knowledge, gained under colonial rule, formed the backbone of the new force. Both armies inherited more than equipment and personnel. They inherited traditions of discipline, hierarchy, and professionalism. Parade drills, regimental customs, and codes of conduct remained familiar. But their purpose had changed completely. The focus of service shifted inward. No longer deployed to distant lands for imperial interests, soldiers now guarded national borders. They protected fragile administrations and supported internal stability. The months following independence were tense. Boundaries were new, systems untested, and expectations high. The army was often called upon to act as a stabilizing force. Its conduct during this period shaped public confidence in the nation itself. For the soldiers, identity evolved gradually. They were no longer servants of empire. They were defenders of country. The oath they lived by was no longer tied to distant authority, but to the land beneath their feet. By the end of 1947, the colonial Indian Army had ceased to exist. In its place stood two national armies, facing uncertain futures. They carried the weight of history and the responsibility of independence. Their transformation marked one of the most significant military transitions of the 20th century. The story of independence is often told through leaders and politics. But it is also the story of ordinary soldiers who adapted in extraordinary times. Men trained for obedience learned to serve new ideals. Through continuity and change, they ensured that the end of empire did not mean the collapse of order. In that moment of division, the army became more than a fighting force. It became a symbol of continuity amid rupture. From colonial institution to national guardian, its journey reflected the transformation of the subcontinent itself. The empire departed quietly, but the soldiers remained. Their uniforms changed, their flags changed, their mission changed. Yet their discipline endured. Through them, independence was not only declared. It was defended. The moment of independence marked a quiet but profound turning point for the Indian Army. The uniforms remained. The barracks still stood. Drill grounds echoed with familiar rhythms. Yet the purpose behind every movement had changed. An army once shaped to serve an empire now faced the task of serving a nation newly responsible for its own destiny. In the early days after independence, continuity was unavoidable. Structures built over decades did not vanish overnight. Training manuals, command systems, and administrative routines were inherited from the past. Soldiers who had once served under colonial authority now stood under a national flag. This transition required patience, discipline, and careful balance. For many within the ranks, independence brought a deep sense of pride. Service was no longer tied to distant power. It was connected to homeland and people. The idea of duty shifted. Defense was no longer about maintaining imperial order, but about protecting borders, unity, and sovereignty. This change transformed the meaning of the uniform. Leadership underwent steady change. Experience gained under colonial rule now guided national command. Continuity ensured stability, while reform opened pathways that had long been closed. Authority began to reflect the nation it served. The army became a symbol of unity in a diverse country. Soldiers came from different regions, languages, and traditions. Within the ranks, these differences were brought together under shared discipline and purpose. The army reflected the idea that unity did not require uniformity. It required commitment to a common future. Training evolved to match new realities. Doctrine shifted toward national defense rather than imperial deployment. Strategy focused on borders rather than overseas campaigns. The soldier was no longer expected to fight for distant interests, but to stand ready for the defense of home. This change reshaped mindset as much as method. The legacy of the imperial past did not disappear. It remained in traditions, regimental histories, and institutional memory. For some, this past was a source of professional pride. For others, it was a reminder of inequality and constraint. The army carried both perspectives forward, acknowledging complexity rather than erasing it. These visible changes reinforced deeper transformation. The army was no longer an inherited instrument. It was a national institution. The relationship between soldier and society also evolved. Public perception shifted as the army came to represent collective security rather than colonial authority. Service was seen as contribution to nation building. Veterans returned home not as servants of empire, but as defenders of independence. This change strengthened the bond between army and people. Challenges were inevitable. New borders brought uncertainty. Regional tensions tested readiness. The army faced early trials that required resilience and adaptability. Experience from the past proved valuable, but solutions had to be rooted in national interest. Leadership learned quickly that independence demanded responsibility as much as freedom. Modernization followed gradually. Equipment, organization, and training adapted to changing conditions. Yet the core values of discipline, sacrifice, and professionalism remained constant. These qualities had been forged long before independence, but now they served a different purpose. The same discipline that once enforced empire now protected sovereignty. For soldiers, identity deepened. They were no longer caught between command and conscience. Service aligned more closely with belief. The idea of defending one's own land carried emotional weight. This connection strengthened morale and commitment, turning duty into personal responsibility. The army also became a stabilizing force during times of uncertainty. Its discipline symbolized order in moments of change. The past informed the present, but did not control it. As years passed, the Indian Army continued to define itself on its own terms. Traditions were preserved with intention. Leadership reflected national diversity. The Army's story became intertwined with the story of the nation itself, shaped by both memory and vision. The imperial past remained part of this story, complex and unresolved. It could not be ignored, nor did it need to dominate. It offered lessons in structure, endurance, and caution. The future, however, belonged to a force shaped by independence, accountable to its people, and guided by national purpose. Today, the Indian Army stands as a reminder that institutions can transform without losing their core. It shows how service can be redefined, how loyalty can shift from empire to nation, and how history can be carried forward with honesty rather than denial. The journey after empire was not a break, but a passage. From command to conscience. From inheritance to identity. From imperial service to national defense. Its history reflects loyalty and sacrifice, but also control and contradiction. Understanding this story helps us see how military power can shape nations and destinies. Thank you for listening and for exploring history with care. May learning from the past help us better understand the present. Until next time, take care, and stay curious.